People at the fair mistook the chapel for the Alamo itself. But we didn't have the whole story either. Our toy marksman could not have taken cover behind the iconic parapet, which was added years later. Not all the Texans had fought valiantly. The desperate tied white socks to their bayonets and tested their Spanish. Tengan clemencia, valiente mexicanos. While deserters were cut down by the lancers waiting for them. Davy Crockett, who went by David and was from Tennessee, was probably captured and executed by Santa Anna. Santa Anna had ordered no quarter, but he spared women, children, and enslaved black men. Our textbook did not say that slavery was illegal in Mexico, and was why the Texans did not want to be Mexicans anymore. Spanish-speaking Tejanos also fell at the hands of Spanish-speaking Mexicans, and the Texans had parlayed with the Cherokee and their allies to protect their northern frontier. Brad and I had painted only beige and blue figures. We were told that Remember the Alamo was about remembering those who had died for liberty, a sacrifice Brad and I thought we were commemorating. But the liberty at stake at the Alamo seemed always to belong only to white men, like its commanders, William Travis, who owned slaves, and Jim Bowie, who trafficked them. Over time, it must have been easier to remember the losing than the slavery, even though the Texans put the latter in writing. The 1836 Constitution of the Republic of Texas barred, quote, Africans, the descendants of Africans, and Indians from citizenship. And black people could be neither free nor emancipated in Texas. None of this appeared in our textbook. Remember the Alamo sounded like you were being told to pay attention to history, but it was the opposite. Those who said it made you think that they remembered more than you did or could. You were to skip ahead. As a boy, I didn't know that the Texans could not be beige without others being blue or black or Indian. They were beige precisely because they weren't black and blue. Our model, which froze time, should have reminded us. But we read about the battle only after its conclusion, which settled things. And so when I moved to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, I was kind of happy to get away from that type of culture which celebrated a racist myth, quite simply, of the Alamo. But I also found that Eau Claire had a history too. Until my son was born, I was the only person of color living on my block. The city of Eau Claire, Wisconsin wasn't diverse then and still isn't. Our house resides in a ward shaped roughly like a human stomach, its western edge hugging the angular east bank of the Chippewa River, which leads the way in from the north like a great esophagus. The Chippewa flows southwest for about 50 miles until it hits the Mississippi at the Minnesota border. Our neighborhood is known for the historic homes lining its boulevards, one Gothic revival dating back to Reconstruction, not in this part of the country, but due south, just down the river. And just a couple more pages here. When my son was a few years old, and I was no longer the only person of color on my block, our neighbor Jan dropped by to give him a present. We chatted about where Jacob might go to preschool the next year. Their church had an excellent 4K program, Jan said. and she wanted to know what my hopes were for him. He'll be out on his own before you know it, Jan said. Off to college. Maybe he's not college material, I joked. The way Chinese fathers might talk about their sons to protect them from jealous gods. Too much of the college talk coming from Chinese American fathers lately. Jan made a face, then smiled politely. The public schools in town were excellent, she told me. We complained about our property taxes, but agreed that we got our money's worth. All I knew about the nearby high school, if you know Eau Claire, this is Memorial High School. All I knew about the nearby high school was that it had stuck a terrifying model of its mascot on its roof. A fiberglass bald eagle the size of a pterodactyl, named Old Abe. The real Old Abe was a war eagle, carried into battle by the 8th Wisconsin at Vicksburg and in other Civil War campaigns. The great bird, supposedly earning salutes from men like Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. When I first moved to Wisconsin, I was glad to settle in a state that had fought for the Union, with monuments like Old Abe, no less. But it was strange that a state that had ostensibly fought for black people had so few of them in it. It was strange that the Mississippi River that rolled through here was the same river that ended in Louisiana. Parts of the upper Midwest chose not to segregate by race so much as banish by it. Their landscape dotted with sundown towns. Black elders dictated their unwritten rules to their children with the ferocity of tiger parents. And well into the 20th century, government-run agencies in Wisconsin systematically separated Native American families from the Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, and Oneida nations, among others, removing thousands of children from their homes and communities and relocating them into the boarding schools, which forced their assimilation into the dominant white culture. Our mascots around the state were war eagles, yes, but also warriors and chiefs. So as I said, I believe that home is best thought of, at least for me, as a relationship. And for me, being able to be in Texas and then also being a part of my community in Eau Claire, you have to come to terms with that place. You can't have any romantic delusions about where you live, about your home. It's not always ingratiating when I talk to friends in Eau Claire and I say, hey, did you know this about the sundown history of this area? I think too often there is this romanticization of the local in towns like Eau Claire. Home's like a relationship because you have to work on it to make it the place that's best for everyone involved. And so that's partly what I'm hoping my book will accomplish. So thank you.
The thing has to be plugged in for it to continue, and I do have this here. So if you have any possibility of making that happen, we can continue.
Yeah, I don't know if we're close enough to, there's power here.
Okay, that's perfect. So while we're plugging this in, I'll tell you one of the only jokes I know.
Oh, good.
Wait, now, is this gonna work?
Not sure if you
Okay, wait. Oh, here it is. No, this plugs in, that plugs into the same place my power has to plug in. Oh, wait, I know. Okay, knock, knock.
Who's there?
Control freak. Now you say control freak.
Control freak.
have an idea. There's
Okay.
so many different things to plug into so many different things.
I see what I can do.
So this is the power cord, because it said it was running out
Okay.
of power. This is the other thing I have, which you can plug, if I were to take this out, you could plug something else into it, okay?
All right,
So you may or may not,
you tell more jokes.
you saw something there, you may or may not. So, beyond the joke, I have other things to share. So I also had some thoughts about how I think of home, and I tried to select pieces that show different aspects. As the slides were running, we got a clear sense that place is important to me, as we belong to a place. Also that we have a homeland, but we can be displaced from our homeland. There's so many things, and I have a lot of other notes that I'll kind of touch on, if that's okay, after I read you a few poems. Because I think the poems are going to introduce some ideas, and then I'll follow up with just a few comments, and then we can see what we want to say. So my new book is Ancient Light, and I'm going to read from that, but I'm going to start with some older pieces. How's that? Good? All right. So this first one is from my book, Copper Earring, and it is one of the earliest poems in the book. It's the poem. It's called Wellspring, Words from Water. A white earth childhood, water rich and money poor, vaporous beings transformed in cycles, the alluvial stories pulled from Minnesota's lakes, harvested like whitefish, like monomen, like old prophecies of seeds growing on water. Legends of Anishinaabe spirit beings, cloud-bearer thunderbird who brings us rain, winter windigo like ice woman, or Mishubishu who roars with spit and hiss of rapids, great underwater panther. You copper us to these tributaries of balance, rills, a cosmology of Nabi. We believe our bodies thirst, our earth, one element, Anabishabu, tea brown wealth, like maple sap, amber, the liquid eye of moon. Now she turns tide, and each wetted being gyrates to the sound, her river body curving. We, women of ancient waters, endure. Like each flower drinks from night, holds dew. Our bodies a libretto, saturated an aquifer. We speak words from ancient waters. So that one touches on several things, including the way that our relationship with home is partly constructed on stories that we learn of home. And this is a poem from Apprentice to Justice, which is a few books ago. And it is dealing with the physical, the building home. So there's a story that goes with this. When I was a young scholar, I was invited by University of Minnesota Press, along with my colleague Brenda Child, who's now at Minnesota, and we were asked to write an intro to the newly released book. It was an older book they were releasing again called Housing Conditions of 150 Chippewa Families. And it was by Sister Inez Hilger.
And so I was unfamiliar with her work. She did work in Minnesota, she did work in Wisconsin and other places. And the way that Sister Hilger did her work at White Earth and other places is she was studying housing conditions and she had an idea. And so she went in and she surveyed everything. So let's pretend that I'm Sister Hilger, I'm coming to your house, and I just appear and tell you I need to measure and count everything in your house. So for me, that was a little presumptuous that someone had the right to go into somebody else's house. And also, there's a pretty big leap from the statistics which she collected to her conclusions, which were not about houses, but about morality and so forth. So I was a little troubled by this study. And so my intro said, this is a pretty classic representation of social science in that era when these sorts of perspectives led some of the research. But I also said, despite that, right, there are many things we know now that we wouldn't have known, many details, many photographs, etc. So I tried to give a sort of balanced view of what that new release of that older book, how people should think about it and how they might need to engage their own mind, their own ability to critique when they were looking at the data and her conclusions. So anyway, that's a long story to say I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about someone coming to my home of White Earth Nation and going into all these people's houses, not asking permission, simply arriving. And I don't imagine you'd want me to count how many blue dresses you have or how many pieces of silverware if I came to your house. So I was a little troublesome. So I couldn't only leave it with that scholarship. And so I have actually a series of poems that address this study. And this one was the first one I published. And it's called Housing Conditions of 150 Chippewa Families. And we would call this now documentary poetry. And I take language from the document and I put it in the poem. And in some of the language is also mine. And I'll try to distinguish that by the way I read it. White Earth Reservation, 1938. Wigwam, peaked lodge, bark house, teepee, log house, tar paper shack, frame house, U.S. rehabilitation house. Sister Hilger, you counted each one. 71 tar paper shacks, 8 United States rehabilitation houses, 2 wigwams, bark houses at rice camps. You graphed, photographed, measured dimensions, calculated cubic airspace, enumerated every construction detail, 23 with broken windows, 99 without foundations, buildings resting on the ground, 98 with stovepipes for chimneys, house, dwelling, place, structure, home, and on. June to November, the year my mother turned 5, Mary Inez, you walk these lands, the fervor of your order tucked under one billowing black-sleeved arm, amassing details of crowded quarters, common law marriages, miscegenation, illegitimate children, limited education, economic dependence on the WPA and the CCCs, for charts that have outlived those Anishinaabe of the 150 chosen families. Now you perch in my history at one of the 71 homemade or 79 factory-made tables, sitting tall and precise on one of the 84 benches, 49 backless chairs, or 8 armchairs, or standing, Mary Inez, in the homes of one of the 16 tar paper shack families, or 8 frame house families, for which you record none under the heading of chairs. Methodically recite like prayers of deliverance each prepared question. Why are there so many unmarried mothers on the reservation? Why are there so many common law marriages on the reservation? What do you think can be done to stop the drinking to intoxication among the Indians? I hear you interrogate each family, daily gathering indulgences or ink-smudged statistics on what you label in caps social problems. Any unmarried mother in the home, any intoxication in the home, so dutifully you prompt each betrayal, father, mother, son, daughter, and then remind yourself in print, in a parenthetical aside, of the unreliability of the interviewee. Check this information with some outside person, as if anyone then or now could forget with whom resides the authority of your social accounting. Ah, sister, I pity you, the prickly mystery of those questions whose answers could not be checked nor changed by some reliable outside person. So confidently you asked, would you like to leave this home? But 73% of the occupants of tar paper shacks on White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota in 1938 said no. No matter, you wrote, how dilapidated and inadequate the homes were, the tar paper shack families were quite unwilling to leave them. So they were asked again, asked another way, because it was thought, knowing the alternative might change their mind. Would you like to move into a rehabilitation house, one of those fine new houses the Indian Bureau built for the Indians? But the negative answers grew. Fewer still would think of leaving their home. Not 35-year-old Anna, 50-year-old Mary, not a widowed mother, 61 years of age, living on the outskirts of one of the highway towns, not old man Mink, 78 years of age, nor his wife, 10 years his junior, who agreed they liked their one-room shack, not Mike, 29 and a regular League of Nations, nor his white wife Jane, 28, nor their 10-year-old son, Gawi Nawi Naginisim, like Jim, 48 years of age, and Ella, 38, they wanted to stay in the old, ramshackle, tar paper covered homes. And did you hear the bulrush songs of Galaba Bibonikag as you painstakingly recorded each softly intoned exclamation? And does the land remember you, Sister Inez of the tar paper shack dwellers, as surely as it remembers Mary, who felt well acquainted with the woods, or Anna, who believed she was living more like the old Indian ways. Somewhere in that rolling land of rich loam is the adorned body of old man Mink, and perhaps somewhere roams the spirit of the midday woman elder who vowed, I'll stay right here, I won't leave here, I've lived here too long. I wonder, Mary Inez, did your BIA commission sojourn in a land of white clay somewhere leave its soul mark, looming coal-black at the ruled edges of report ledgers, spilling into cautious recollection, even as a measured drip of black ink might draw tabulations upon white pages. Before Minnesota winter winds rattled the 162 full-size, 104 half-size, and 47 less than half-size unbroken windows. Before that baboon Odin blew through those 23 houses with cardboard-covered broken windows, or blew through your tight-lipped post-allotment spirituality, you returned to the Order of St. Benedict and to the list of standards set out in 1935 by the National Association of Housing Officials, those standards against which all our measurements fall short, become substandard, subhuman. You left, Mary Inez, the Latin Mass and Rosary zipped safely in one pocket, the names of each Medeviwan elder drumming and chanting in the other. It's been a long time since I read that. I didn't realize quite how much emphasis was in there. So, a poem that is one that you may all connect with is about the cycles of home and how when we live in a place for a long time, that is part of who we become, that we have that expectation of how the cycles will develop in our home. And so this is from my newer book, and it is called A Catalog of Migration. Here in the dictionary of sky, Dagwagan meaning full, mean cobalt holding motion of wings, wings bending clock, bending time again, and daso Dagwagan every fall, breath, eternity blowing cycle, watch airstreams funnel, then unfurl like rivers, swirl and sing, Nagamo, this pouring of bird bodies. Beneath departing talons and tail feathers, amid the trumpeting call of Wabazi, mighty wingspan of owl, coo, 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 ooh. Everywhere mallard, oriole, checkerbacked loons. Soon air fills with echo of sandhill crane calls, fluted and eternal like dotem dream songs, where every fall, every flap follows ancient flight paths. Beneshin Yug mark autumn sky, mark me. Fall lean, the trees become teepee poles, circled in migration, hold up the tent of sky, here in the dome of belonging, where each wet, alive touches another God body, touches being, pine tips bow low like suitors, here beneath this lush, this blessed orgy. Okay, I'm gonna read just a couple more. Sorry, I didn't realize how long that housing conditions was. It's been years since I've read it.
It was worth it.
Oh, it was worth it. He says, thank you so much. Okay, so how many of you have ever homesick or somewhere that you've been? So this is a poem, this is a very early poem of mine. When I first left White Earth and I was at college and I was homesick. And memory becomes a kind of home for us. You know, we reconnect with our home through our memory. And for me, this was like memory became a sort of ritual. So this is called Rituals, Yours and Mine. 1, living by your words as if I haven't enough of my own ever to make them stretch that long distance from home to here, from then to now, and all the new words I've ever read, learned, or shelved so neatly can't explain myself to me like yours always do. Sometimes that one gesture of your chin and lips, my memory of the sideways movement of your eyes, are the only words from that language I can manage to put things in their place. 2, walked in on you today, closed the screen door quietly so you wouldn't notice just yet, stood, watched you mumbling, shuffling about the kitchen, your long yellow-gray braid hanging heavy down your back. Wanted to see you turn just that way, hear that familiar exclamation, you snapping the dish towel, landing it just short of me. Shame on me for surprising you. You walk toward me, laughing. Don't change anything, I chant quietly, wiping your hands on your faded print apron. You lay them gently, still damp, cool, one on each side of my face for that long, long second. When'd you come? Sit down, I'm making breakfast. I watch the wrinkled, loose flesh jiggle on your arms as you reach to wind and pin your braid. Hurry to find your teeth behind the water pail. Pull up your peanut butter stockings, pull down your flowered house dress, and wet your fingers to smooth the hair back behind your ears. 3, smoothing away time with the fluid line of your memory. I am in place at your table. In the morning damp of the still, dark kitchen, I wait for you to come. Stepping through the curtained doorway, you enter intent on this day. Restart the fire, fill, place the kettle, pull open the kitchen door, inviting daylight to come, welcoming it into your house, bringing it into mine. So I think I have a million poems. I think we should stop with that one so we have time to talk. But if we run out of things to say, I'll read more to you. So I can just, some of the things I'm going to talk about, I didn't necessarily illustrate, but I do have a couple of thoughts, just like about the idea of home. And as I said, I do think of it as a place, and this place in particular, if you were there last night, you would have heard me read a lot of poems about place. But I do think also we have attachments to physical building. We have an attachment to people, family, to a community, a larger community. That's the relationship, that we have this, relationship in its You could go to another community, it's not the same home. There are symbols we have of home. There are food, clothing, songs, stories, etc. that all for us, if we're traveling and we see somebody wearing, like, it could be a Letterman's jacket from our high school, or it could be something else that's, culturally obvious. And it makes us remember our home, right? Home is that last poem is memory, it's history, and it is, I think, in that way, a belonging as opposed to an owning. So we can say, you own a building, but you belong to a community, a place, a people, right? And so that's a different sense of being home. I actually wrote this long essay called A Cosmology of Nabi, which is a cosmology of water. And it talks about, partly talks about the way that our home constructs a lens through which we understand the world, a lens through which we see the world. It's where we learn values. What do we value, what don't we value? So many things. And then the other thing is that home is always evolving and changing until we leave. And then we have this fixed memory of what a place is, what our home was. So years ago, I was in Norway, and I don't remember, like where I grew up in Minnesota, there were also a lot of Norwegian people. And so the phrase "ufta" was kind of common, and so it's still in my vocabulary. So I was in Norway, and something happened. I said, "Oh, ufta," and they were like, "What?" So then they started talking about how they actually come to the States to learn some things like rose mowing, because in Norway, it's evolved, it's not the same. But here, the people who left and became immigrants in the US have kept all the old ways of doing it. So it's kind of fascinating. And so anyway, there are the tangible and intangible things about home, and I think they're all worthy of thinking about.
Thanks, Kimberly. I was struck by so much of what you said, and kind of connections between what you're saying about home and what I'm trying to say about home in Chinese Prodigal. Your poem about Inez Hilger was the one that hit hardest for me, given its own power and also what I'm interested in as a writer and a scholar. It made me think, it seems as though a study like Hilger's is almost kind of like the basis of a type of social work methodology, right? That masquerades as science.
Oh, yeah.
That, do you have this in your home? Do you have that in your home? Do you eat a meal together? How often do you eat a meal together? And then under the guise of social science, it's used to separate families. And what I was thinking about is that if we're not careful, with our art as a response to these so-called objective social sciences, that it can be the state that gets to define what home is for you. And so for so many Native children, right, the state gets to define what counts as home, not their family, not their blood. It made me think about my own family, and how I have a chapter on food waste. I mean, food waste.
Okay.
And so when you think about Asian American people talking about their experiences, I think too often it returns to food. And you probably know what I mean. You know, if you see, you know, any movies or TV shows about Asian American families, like food becomes the kind of the defining element for Asian American families. And so that's what I was thinking about. It's like, how do you eat as a family? Is it normal to eat that way? Does it mean that you're a strong family, that you eat fast food, or you eat on the road? Why don't you eat dinner at the same time, at the same table together? Well, there's lots of reasons. There's lots of reasons why families might find it hard to do that. And so that chapter is all about how thinking about the food ways of the dominant culture can be kind of a lens, right, into its own values. You had said that home constructs the lens through which we see the world. And I absolutely believe that. But for me, the home wasn't the house where I grew up. You know, home was, believe it or not, the public school, because I was good at it. And my teachers were kind and nice and supportive to me. And I wanted to be just like them. And so the lens that was created through which I saw the world was a place where I felt more at home, which was the school, versus the house with my parents, who I loved, absolutely. But I saw them in a way that the dominant society also saw them, right? Which is as not quite fully belonging and lacking in certain important ways. And so that's another thing that I try to explore in the book, was the ways that I say somewhere like, it's hard to disagree with people who are complimenting you.
Say that again.
It's hard to disagree with people who are complimenting you. And that's the experience of a lot of Asian Americans like me. You're the model minority. And you want to be like those people who admire you and support you. But the other side of the coin is that it drives a wedge between you and your immigrant or refugee parents. And I think I just got lucky, as they say in the book, that I met the right people at the right time to give me a new way of thinking about what had happened to me. Can you take a question?
Yeah.
I can answer the questions.
Comments, disagreements?
How old were you when you moved from Texas to Eau Claire?
So I left Texas for good when I was 21. I moved to Oregon for graduate school. Then I moved to Michigan. Then I moved to Illinois. And then I moved to Eau Claire when I was 29. So there was a momentous moment when I realized early on that I had spent more than half my life outside of Texas. And that's when I really began to reflect upon the ways that I belonged to Wisconsin and how Wisconsin had become a home for me. And so that I kind of mapped along with my own kind of consciousness raising about who I was as a person of color, as an Asian American.
So I'm struck by the idea, I guess, of the home that you grow up in and how powerful that is, and ideas and traditions that you're surrounded by. And coincidentally, I read today a quote from Jimmy Carter when he was talking about what is this whole American myth, basically, of the so-called melting pot. And that it's a flawed way to look at this country because we are really a mosaic. And just because I happened to read it this morning and then listen to both of you, and through that lens, look at how valuable that mosaic is, how much more valuable than the quote-unquote melting pot.
I really appreciate that comment, and I totally agree. And I think that there are other aspects to that, and I think we went through this era where people who came, so those people, we'll not even talk about indigenous people in this moment, but those people who came to this country for various reasons felt that they had to erase some of their background in order to become American. And then there are, also the political reasons that people, hide their identity, keep it, behind closed doors or whatever. And I think it's, you think that all the years that have passed we'd have figured this out, but there's still so much tension about identity and the need to make a sort of monoculture, right? And I agree with you. I think multiculturalism is so much more enjoyable and rich. I love hearing, just for example, I taught at UW-Milwaukee, as was said, and even just working with students, I worked with one student who spent a lot of time in Japan, and so he was translating haiku. He was translating Busan. And nobody wanted to work with him because they were afraid of, I don't know Japanese. Well, I don't know Japanese either, but I know haiku, I know poetry. And so it was very educational for me to be able to work with him. So just one little example. So he would give the poem as it was written in the characters, and then he would translate it literally into English, and then he would translate it into poetic English. So those different steps. And he was thinking, this is great, now you totally get it. But one day I read one of the poems, and we would always meet and talk about each of the translations as he went along. And one of them talked about clothes changing day. I'm like, what does this mean? And of course it's a whole cultural thing that happens, right? And so I thought it was fascinating, and every little thing I learned I thought was interesting, and so I would have him make notes, and so that other people would have access to that information. But we just really, our history and the lens through which we view the world is so much influenced by place and home and culture. And I think we would all be richer if we could allow ourselves to see all of those different perspectives and taste the food or whatever,
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford. There's this really memorable photograph that's in the book that I read a long time ago, and it was a picture of basically like a play that the Ford Motor Company put on, and they had this enormous cauldron. It was probably 2 stories tall, and it said melting pot on it. And you had a stream of workers dressed in, so-called ethnic garb, probably the way that they thought Eastern Europeans would dress, streaming into one end of the pot. And, there would be this kind of triumphant music, and then they would all stream out of the other end of the pot, dressed the way that that American people dressed. And so that was the point. I think that's a really misunderstood metaphor. When they say that it's a melting pot, I think they mean to say that we're a plural society. What it meant from history was that your ethnicity was erased to kind of turn you into like everybody else. And I'll say this, I think some people are surprised. I'm 54 years old, and I think they're surprised when they hear me say that I still feel as though I have to prove myself to native-born Americans, particularly native-born white Americans, to the point where, let's say that I meet a stranger and we strike up a conversation. There's like this tiny bolt of pride in me when I start speaking the way that I'm speaking now, without any kind of discernible accent, in a fluent English. It didn't go away, right, when consciousness was raised about who I was. There's still a sense that you're kind of proving yourself to the arbiter of who determines who's an American and who's not. That I could talk about the Packers, right, or that I could talk about Hemingway or whatever. That part of me still feels this pride that I wish weren't there, because I know where it comes from, which is the belief that I don't belong as much as that person I'm talking to.
On that point, and I think in certain ways, both of you are displaced in or at least first generation in a different milieu than maybe your heritage. And I don't know what my specific question is, except as the daughter of someone who was born outside this country, there was that displacement both with the dominant culture, but also with her quote home culture, and that sort of having to prove yourself in various places, in various ways, through language and that sort of thing, and how that relates to home.
How that relates to him. Well, I was just gonna, and you may help me remember who wrote about this, but that double consciousness.
Du
With-
Bois.
Okay, and there's, what you're talking about is almost like a triple consciousness, because you have to be, you're trying to, or I understand what you're saying. So let's give you one other example of that from Native American literature. One of the earliest novels written was Kojuia, and I remember it was an older novel, like early 1900s, and you know how they used to have those little photos, those kind of drawn photos, and they have little captions. And one that I will never forget, because the story is this Native woman was in a race, and she wasn't allowed to be in the squaws race because she was a half-breed. And then, so she had to race in the white race. So she won the white race, but then she was disqualified because she was not white. So there's this picture of her, and it said, "Despised of two races." You know, that old-fashioned language, "despised of two races." But that's kind of what you're talking about, that way of not feeling accepted by this group or that group or whatever. And I did want to speak to that sense of measurement, that we have to measure up to a standard that somebody else has set for us. I mean, literally in that housing condition thing. But the ones we put on ourselves, like in our own head. I know when I went up for tenure many years ago, you have to have a book for tenure. Well, I said, I'm having 2 books. Because I didn't want anyone to say, oh, she got that because she's, a minority. Because you really feel like you can't just do the thing. You have to do the thing plus the thing and the other thing, right? Yeah, there is that sort of strange pressure, I think, that we feel. And bizarrely, I think, for me, Indigenous people have been displaced, but this is our homeland, Yeah.
I'm not sure about your family history or ethnicity, but there's a line from the first chapter of the book that I read this morning. It's just one sentence that hopefully captures what you're talking about. The crucial moment for an immigrant family is when the child ignores, or at best humors, the fears of their parents. And that's when the balance between them forever tilts. If you have immigrant parents, especially if they're immigrants of color, and they don't speak English well, maybe when you're 8, 9, definitely by the time you're a teenager, the power has inverted. in your household because you speak English. And that's when you start seeing your parents the way that the dominant society might, which is this slightly inferior, even inferior to yourself.
Should we have that? Or should I go out on a tone?
Thank you.
Like in 2 seconds.
Eye-opening, for me at least, I'm sure it was for everyone else too.
Do you wanna?
Thank you,
Yes,
John.
she said yes. Okay, I'll find a really short one. I have these Way We Love Something small poems,
Okay.
and they're very, 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 I'll put this on so I can find the page really quickly. Okay.
So, this one is place. There are others that are others, but the way we love something small. So this is a Wisconsin poem and a Minnesota poem. Some of you, the way we love something small. In deepest winter, here when I turn from rebuttal, ice gathers, crackles, sings under snow boots, shatters and reforms. Hoar frost feathers adorn each surface, white on white. My eyes confess a longing for oldest patterns, a key, earth's intricate, a writ constellation. Each frozen word on lips of water, a sweet note, amended silence.